When you think of computer science, you probably imagine this. But the reality looks a lot more like this. I know this because that is exactly what I thought going in. Now, before I go any further, I should say that my experience may differ from, anyone else's. Computer science programs vary from university to university. In my case, I didn't only major in computer science. I also majored in statistics, which originally started as mathematics, but that's a story for another day. In this video, I will be focusing purely on the computer science side of things, what my first, second, and third years looked like, and what I actually learned over roughly 1,000 days. And I want to preface this by saying something important. This degree was theoretically dense. For the most part, we weren't learning how to use tools. We're learning the fundamentals behind them. As a result, there was surprisingly very little programming. So if you went into computer science expecting to code all day, every day, you might have been looking for software engineering instead. Again, that is a video for another time. With that said, let's get into it. Now, year one was for the most part an introduction to programming. We covered basic Python and C++. Programming modules were designed in a very beginner-friendly way, which meant that if you had any prior coding experience, they were fairly straightforward. And to be clear, that's not a bad thing. These courses were structured so that complete beginners could keep up, understand the fundamentals, and still perform reasonably well. In hindsight though, these programming modules felt more like teasers instead, because as the degree progressed, actual programming became increasingly rare. If you wanted to refine your coding skills, you had to do that entirely in your own time. And that sounds fine until you realize that there's always this monster lurking in the background called mathematics. Now, aside from the computer science modules themselves, year one demanded a lot more mathematical effort than I think most people would expect when they hear computer science. So, in a nutshell, year one was a solid introduction, especially for beginners. But personally, I didn't feel like I learned much that was new. Most of it was material I had already encountered either in high school or through self-study. Now, year two is where things really start to shift. This is when you're introduced to object-oriented programming, data structures and algorithms, the core pillars of computer science. Now, all of this was taught in Java, which I genuinely enjoyed. But here's the key difference. We weren't just learning how to use these concepts. We were learning them from the ground up. We weren't told, here's a data structure, now use it. Instead, it was more like, here's why this data structure exists, how it's built, how it behaves under different conditions, and what trade-offs it introduces. Now, you had to understand these ideas at a very deep, almost uncomfortable level. Year two was a rude awakening. Completely dismantled this idea that programming is just opening an IDE, installing a few packages, writing some code, and calling it a day. It showed that everything we take for granted in modern software, such as performance, efficiency, reliability, is built on layers of careful design, mathematical reasoning, and theoretical foundations. Now, year three was rather frustrating, because right when you start thinking, okay, maybe now we'll finally build some serious project, you pulled even deeper into theory. Now, this year focused on databases, artificial intelligence, computer networks, and operating systems. And on paper, these sound exciting, and they are, don't get me wrong, but not in a way that most people would expect. Almost everything was entirely theoretical, pen and paper throughout. There were system models and abstract reasoning, very little code, and sometimes no code at all. At times, I genuinely found myself asking, is this even worth it? What are we actually doing here? But once again, the emphasis wasn't on using these systems. It was on understanding them at their most fundamental level. Why databases behave the way they do, how operating systems manage resources, and what actually happens when data moves across a network. Now, we did have some database related projects, but they weren't nearly enough to fill the gap left by the lack of hands-on work. Now, with that said, I do think there's value in this approach. By the end of it, you're far better equipped to reason about complex problems, not just in software, but in general as well. So yes, while it was disappointing to realize that I wouldn't be doing as much programming as I had expected, I would still choose computer science again without hesitation. Because what you gain isn't just the ability to write some code. You gain a deep understanding of why things work the way they do, along with rigorous training in logic, abstraction, and mathematics. Computer science doesn't train you to use tools. It trains you to build and understand them. So when people say computer science is dead, or that it's being replaced by AI, I strongly disagree. But that is a video for another day. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.